On December 7, 2009, at 7:30 p.m. at the county police station in Anhui Province, an emergency call rang out, tearing through the quiet stillness of the summer evening. Swelteringly oppressive, on the other end of the line was the trembling, stuttering voice of a man, as if choked by an indescribable pain. This person identified himself as Ji Hai, a teacher who taught mathematics at the county's key high school. In a strangely calm voice, yet laced with panic, Ji Hai reported to the duty officer that he had just committed a murder. He clearly stated that the victim was Tran Ho, a student he directly taught. The incident occurred at the stone bench area by the artificial canal, and he urgently requested that authorities come immediately, as there was still a glimmer of hope that the student might be saved. Those words, sharp and cold like a knife piercing the silent night, made the duty officer shudder involuntarily. Immediately, a task force from the county police was urgently dispatched, coordinating with an ambulance that sped into the darkness, heading straight to the fateful scene where a bloody tragedy had just unfolded and marked the starting point for an irreparable chain of consequences. So why would a respected teacher like Ji Hai take the life of his own student? Join Mysterious Case in watching this video to uncover the entire truth behind this case. If you find our team's case presentation compelling, please leave a comment with the number 99. If not, please like the video. Before diving into the details of the case, Mysterious Case channel sincerely thanks all of you for always supporting our channel. We hope you'll continue to support us by subscribing to the channel, so we have more motivation to bring you more thrilling cases in the future. And now we invite everyone to explore the details of today's case. When the investigation team and medical personnel arrived at the stone bench around the artificial canal, the yellow streetlights cast a grim glow on a harrowing scene. Tran Ho, a 19-year-old student, lay motionless on the ground, blood from wounds on his abdomen and chest pooling dark red, staining the narrow pathway. His face still bore traces of bewilderment, as if unable to believe the death that was overtaking him. When the police approached, the victim had already passed away. A few meters away, Lilei, Ji Hai's wife, sat slumped on a stone bench, her eyes vacant, her face pale as if drained of life. She mumbled fragmented sentences. "It's all my fault. I didn't expect." As if blaming herself in a state of severe psychological shock. At this moment, Ji Hai stood silently near the victim's body, his hand still gripping a blood-stained folding knife. His eyes were empty, as if his soul had left his body. He showed no resistance, only softly repeating, "I've done something unforgivable. I've destroyed my entire life and his." Ji Hai's voice was choked, weighed down by remorse and despair. Immediately, the crime scene and body examination were swiftly conducted. The results showed that Tran Ho's body had 5 deep wounds on his abdomen and chest, indicating the killer acted ruthlessly without hesitation. A few scratches on the victim's hand suggested he had tried to resist before collapsing. The blood-stained folding knife in Ji Hai's hand was confirmed as the murder weapon and was seized immediately. Additionally, the investigation team found other evidence: Tran Ho's blood-soaked white t-shirt, a few crumpled tissue paper scattered near the stone bench, and a woolen scarf, an item later revealed through investigation to have been knitted by Lilei and given to Tran Ho, a symbol of the illicit relationship between the two. A few local residents nearby were called to provide information the spot. According to an elderly woman selling water by the canal, at the time of the murder she had heard heated arguing, followed by a woman's loud, panicked scream. She stated that 3 people were present at the time: a female teacher, a young man, and a man who arrived last. All 3 were arguing loudly, but out of fear she didn't dare approach to observe closely. Another passerby also confirmed seeing Ji Hai standing near the body with a knife in hand just before the police arrived. Medical personnel confirmed that Tran Ho had died at the scene due to excessive blood loss from the fatal stab wounds. Lilei, in a state of severe psychological shock and with bruises on her arm, possibly from being pushed down while trying to intervene, was rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. Based on Ji Hai's initial statement at the scene, combined with physical evidence and witness testimonies, The investigation team determined that Ji-hai was the perpetrator directly responsible for Tran-ho's death. Immediately, he was restrained and handcuffed right at the stone bench by the canal. Officially arrested on charges of murder. At the interrogation room, Ji-hai confessed to all his criminal actions. Li-lei, born in 1967 in an intellectual family in Anhui Province, where both her father and mother were teachers from a young age. She was raised in an environment filled with the spirit of imparting knowledge, teaching, and resolving doubts, a noble ideal of the teaching profession. This profound influence shaped her belief that teaching was not merely about transmitting knowledge, but also about the responsibility of guiding students into life. Right after graduating from university in the late 1990s, Li-lei was successfully recruited to teach English at a key high school in Anhui Province. At that time, English teachers were in severe shortage, and thus, she was highly valued by the school with generous benefits. In her teaching career, Li-lei quickly demonstrated outstanding competence. She taught diligently, cared deeply for her students, and was repeatedly honored as an outstanding teacher of the year. Many former students later remembered her with admiration. Teacher Li lectured with great passion, able to turn dry grammar points into something interesting. She didn't just teach English. She also taught us how to be better people. She was an ideal role model in our eyes. However, in contrast to her successful educational career, Li-lei's romantic life was fraught with difficulties. During university and after graduation, she experienced 2 relationships, but both ended for various reasons. It wasn't until she was over 30 that Li-lei gradually lowered her standards for choosing a partner and finally married a colleague from the same school, a 12th grade math teacher named Ji-hai. Ji-hai was 2 years older than his wife. With a gentle and upright personality, well liked by colleagues and students at the school, both being teachers, they shared the same professional aspirations in life. Perspectives. In everyone's eyes, they were a heaven-made match. Perfectly suited for each other. After marriage, they quickly had a daughter, building a family of 3 that seemed perfectly happy, but behind the facade of a seemingly peaceful marriage were silent cracks that grew increasingly difficult to mend. In a letter of repentance written after the case occurred, Li-lei painfully admitted that relationship between her and her husband was no different from that of 2 roommates living under the same roof. No longer a true husband and wife, although both were teachers working in the same educational environment. They rarely had deep conversations. Passion and romance were almost entirely absent from their relationship. Ji-hai immersed himself in his work, teaching, and his students' achievements, while Li-lei increasingly yearned for understanding, for an emotional connection, something she had never felt from the husband shared her life with. Their marriage thus grew colder day by day, passing quietly like a still lake without ripples until a fierce storm suddenly swept in, carrying away all that remained of trust and morality. In the fall of 2008, the high school where Li-lei and her husband worked had begun dividing classes into natural sciences and social sciences. At that time, Tran-ho, a 19-year-old student, was assigned to the class taught by Ji-hai. Tran-ho came from a poor rural area in Anhui Province. His parents were simple farmers, and the family's financial situation was extremely difficult due to their hardships. He had to take a year off school to work in the fields, helping his parents farm and earn a little money to cover living expenses. These grueling experiences made Tran-ho more mature than his peers. Having tasted life's bitterness early on, due to his special circumstances, the school reviewed his case and granted him a subsidy for disadvantaged students. At this moment, Tran-ho's appearance was like a fresh breeze, suddenly blowing into the dull and cold life of the teacher, Li-lei, a woman gradually losing her emotions in a loveless marriage. In the memories of his classmates, Tran-ho was always a simple person, reserved but extremely serious and disciplined. His clothes were often faded from being washed too many times, yet always neat and clean as if new. He rarely joined class gatherings, always citing the need to save money for personal expenses, despite his difficult life. Tran-ho never complained. On the contrary, he always maintained an optimistic attitude. Working diligently and quietly in everything he did, Tran-ho stood about 1.8 meters tall, With a sturdy, muscular build from years of manual labor, his sharp, masculine features made him stand out among a class of high school students, most of whom were lanky and scholarly. Because of this, many female students secretly had their eyes on him. However, due to his quiet and aloof personality, Tran Ho always kept his distance from others, making it hard for people to get close to him. Academically, Tran Ho was a typical student with uneven performance. He excelled in natural sciences like mathematics and physics, especially mathematics, where he frequently scored perfect marks without needing much guidance. But in stark contrast, English was a true nightmare for Tran Ho. Despite doubling his efforts compared to his peers, his grades hovered around average, and at times even fell below average. Teacher Ji Hai, who directly taught mathematics to Tran Ho, often expressed admiration to colleagues about his students' abilities. According to him, Tran Ho possessed a rare mathematical talent for some complex, challenging math problems that even Ji Hai took time to solve. Tran Ho could find a concise and creative solution in just a few minutes because of his intelligence, diligence, and relentless pursuit of progress. Tran Ho became a student Ji Hai particularly cared for and favored during classes. Ji Hai often created opportunities for his studento stand up and explain problem-solving methods. Outside of class, Ji Hai also spent extra time tutoring him privately, hoping to help Tran Ho reach greater heights. In Ji Hai's eyes, Tran Ho was a precious seed if nurtured properly, fully capable of gaining admission to a prestigious university, thereby escaping the poverty that plagued his hometown. However, the obstacle called English remained a critical weakness, directly threatening the dream of changing his life. Tran Ho was pouring all his effort into pursuing. One evening, after finishing his teaching session, Ji Hai returned home in a heavy mood. During dinner, he brought up Tran Ho's situation to share with his wife. Ji Hai told her that his class had a very talented student with outstanding potential, but his English grades were extremely poor. His impoverished background made it impossible for him to afford extra lessons. He hesitantly asked Li Lei, who was running a tutoring class at home, if she could help his student a little. Li Lei, who always supported her husband's work and was accustomed to teaching extra classes, immediately nodded in agreement without hesitation, but neither of them could have imagined at the time that this seemingly simple decision, born out of compassion, would be the first step in opening the door to a heartbreaking tragedy where suppressed emotions, blurred moral boundaries, and the fates of three people gradually slid into an inescapable abyss. The tutoring sessions began shortly after. At first, everything proceeded very properly. 3 times a week after school hours, Tran Ho would come to Li Lei's private home for a one-on-one English tutoring. Li Lei, being a responsible teacher, quickly designed a detailed study plan for Tran Ho, starting from the most basic knowledge, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and reading comprehension skills. For his part, Tran Ho did not disappoint his teacher. He always completed his assignments fully, proactively asked questions when facing difficulties, and was diligent and polite. However, the increasingly frequent interactions between the two began to create subtle changes, yet concerning ones. Outside of study hours, they started sharing more about their personal lives. Li Lei gradually realized that Tran Ho's life was far more arduous than she had ever imagined. Tran Ho was born into a deeply troubled family. His father was a chronic alcoholic. His mother endured in silence, and almost the entire burden of the household fell on the young boy's shoulders. From a very early age, Tran Ho once told Li Lei that in 4th grade, when his mother fell ill and his father was too drunk to stand, he had to walk 10 kilometers alone through mountainous terrain to fetch a doctor. Though his voice was steady with little fluctuation as he recounted this, his eyes were chillingly haunting, exuding an unnatural early maturity of a child deprived of familial warmth. That very story touched the deepest, most hidden part of the soul of a woman languishing in a loveless marriage. From the simple empathy of a teacher, Li Lei began to show Tran Ho a level of care that went beyond professional boundaries. She didn't just teach, she also quietly looked after him. Like a mother worrying for her only son, she prepared snacks for him after lessons, reminded him about meals, and even during the freezing winter days, Li Lei personally knitted a woolen scarf for him as if trying to compensate for some of the deficiencies in his childhood, but this excessive care caused moral boundaries to become increasingly blurred, and it was at this moment that hidden dangers in the shadows began to take shape for Tran Ho, the student who had grown up starved of maternal affection. Li Lei's quiet care was like a sudden downpour, refreshing a parched land after a long drought. Immediately, he began eagerly looking forward to each tutoring session, not only because he wanted to improve his English grades, but also because of the feeling of being cared for, listened to, and understood for the first time in his life. One time, after a late tutoring session, Tran Ho suddenly told Li Lei that this was the first time had felt genuine care from another person. At that moment, his eyes sparkled with an unusual glint, as if trying to hold on to the fragile warmth had just grasped. Li Lei was taken aback. In that brief moment, she didn't know how to respond. Her rationality kept sounding alarm bells, urging her to keep her distance, to stop before things went too far. But her emotions quietly crept in, like groundwater seeping through cracked stone, pulling her in a completely different direction. In the end, she only gently placed her hand on the student's shoulder and uttered a soft word, as if to convince herself that everything was still within acceptable limits. It was in that very moment that the fragile boundary between teacher and student began to blur dangerously. Li Lei didn't realize that the special attention she gave Tran Ho was no longer received by him as purely teacher-student affection, and Li Lei herself, who should have been clear-headed and restrained, began to slide into a wave of emotions that even she could not control. Meanwhile, Ji Hai, the husband engrossed in his teaching work and his students' academic achievements, was completely unaware of the abnormal signs. Gradually emerging within his own household, he only noticed that Tran Ho's English grades were improving significantly, so he endlessly appreciated his wife's help. He paid no attention to the fact that Li Lei had recently been dressing up meticulously for tutoring sessions, nor did he ever suspect the increasingly frequent private meetings between his wife and that student. When he once expressed curiosity about the tutoring sessions held outside the school premises, he received an explanation from his wife that English is a subject tied to emotions, and practicing conversation in a relaxed setting like a cave would help students gain confidence. With absolute trust in his life partner, Ji Hai harbored no suspicions, but it was this very complacency that caused everything to gradually slip out of control. The lingering glances that lasted too long, the seemingly accidental touches, the increasingly intimate private conversations. Little by little, they wove an invisible net full of temptation, tightening around two people in a relationship that could not be made public. One afternoon in early 2009, the pale light of dusk blanketed the residential complex after the last class of the day. As usual, Li Lei saw Tran Ho downstairs. The atmosphere grew eerily silent, with only the flickering streetlights casting shadows in the desolate pathway. Tran Ho hesitated, his eyes filled with layers of emotions. At that moment, Li Lei immediately sensed something very unusual was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her rationality silently urged her to leave immediately, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, unable to move. The student took a deep breath and spoke the confession of feelings had long kept hidden, that he liked Li Lei. Those words rang out like a knife slashing through thin protective layer. Li Lei had struggled to maintain all this time. She was aware that she should immediately reject him, should cut off relationship that was gradually crossing moral boundaries, but in the end, she couldn't do it. The years of a loveless marriage, the long suppressed desires, the loneliness, the nostalgia for youth all erupted at once, sweeping away every barrier in the mind of a woman. Woe seemed so resolute. In the end, under the hazy moonlight in a chillingly quiet setting, the two crossed the forbidden boundary of the teacher-student relationship, embracing each other passionately, engaging in physical intimacy. This was a long, irreversible slide, the beginning of an irredeemable tragedy. From that fateful moonlit night, Li Lei and Tran Ho officially fell into a relationship that was both morally wrong and full of allure and desire. They used the tutoring session sauce, a cover to meet privately and be intimate. Sometimes it was in the tutoring room on the upper floor, Other times in the very apartment where Lilei lived, and there were even times when they met at secluded park benches. Far from the eyes of the world, Ji-Hai's frequent late-night work unwittingly became a perfect shield. Hiding the sinful relationship that was sinking deeper between Lilei and Tran-Ho. Although deep down, Lilei knew very well that everything happening was wrong, that there could be no future between her and Tran-Ho, because she was a wife, a mother, a teacher, and a guide for a student 17 years her junior, but her rationality was gradually pushed back, replaced by a wave of emotions and desires that surged ever more powerfully, pulling her into a dangerous vortex with no escape. In a diary page found later, Lilei once wrote that being with Tran-Ho made her feel like she was back in her 20s, that student that made her feel loved again, needed, and desired things she hadn't experienced from her husband in many years. Those words revealed a glimpse of an inner self that had begun to stray, swept along by desire and prolonged emotional deprivation. As for Tran-Ho, the relationship was like a rite of passage, something he believed was a grand love capable of changing his life. Under Lilei's guidance, Tran-Ho is introduced to the adult world for the first time, a world full of contradictions between love and possession. The gentle care the teacher gave him, a boy who grew up in deprivation and isolation, became the only light in his bleak life at that time. In a message sent to a close friend, Tran-Ho once expressed his determination Faith wasn't afraid of society's opposition, that his love for his teacher was genuine, and that after graduating he would get into university, work, and marry her. Those words brimming with aspirations and fantasy showed that he fully believed in a future with that woman, without realizing the vast gap between reality and illusion. However, life does not operate according to sweet fantasies. That forbiddens love, no matter how carefully concealed, could not last long, because at this moment Ji-Hai, the man who had unwaveringly trusted his wife, began to sense something unusual. A silent undercurrent was quietly forming, threatening to sweep away everything. Once thought to be peaceful. In June 2009, during the final stretch before the college entrance exam, on an unexpected early dismissal due to a schedule adjustment, Ji-Hai decided to go home earlier than usual. Planning to surprise his wife with a small gesture, he immediately went up to the top floor, where the tutoring room his wife used for afternoon sessions was located. He thought he would catch her teaching a student. But no, the room was empty, the lectern deserted, and in the trash can, a few crumpled tissue papers were mixed together. At first, Ji-Hai didn't pay much attention, but as he leaned closer, a familiar scent suddenly hit his senses, a smell that only appeared during intimate, private moments between him and his wife. A horrifying thought flashed through his mind, making his entire body freeze without hesitating for a second. Ji-Hai rushed downstairs, his hands trembling as he inserted the key into the lock, opening the house door in a state of chaos. As the bedroom door swung open, the scene before him shattered his heart. Lilei was sitting dazed on the edge of the bed, her clothes disheveled, her hair a mess, her face panicked as if she had just gone through a major shock. Her eyes avoided her husband's gaze, her voice trembling as she asked why he was back so early. Wasn't he still supposed to be teaching? But Ji-Hai didn't answer. His eyes quickly scanned the familiar room, the home they had shared for years. Now strangely cold and unfamiliar, the bedsheet was askew, the curtains half drawn, and most importantly, the overpowering scent of a man's cologne, unfamiliar, still lingered in the air. It was all like a silent accusation, undeniable, for a husband who had been together for years. No detail escaped his notice. Ji-Hai spoke, his voice eerily calm, but beneath it, a simmering rage like a volcano ready to erupt. He asked where Tran-Ho was. That question made Lilei freeze in place. Her face instantly drained of color. She hadn't expected her husband to utter that name, which meant he knew, or at the very least, suspected too much to ignore. In a desperate attempt to hide the truth, Lilei tried to deny it, but her trembling voice betrayed everything. Ji-Hai stepped closer, his eyes like ice, his hand tightly gripping his wife's wrist. He questioned her relentlessly. When did this relationship start? Since when had his wife betrayed him? Was it from the time he trusted her to tutor that poor student, or even earlier? Faced with increasingly intense questioning and no way out, Lilei completely broke down. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming like rain, sobbing as she confessed the entire truth. The illicit relationship between her and Tran Ho had been going on for nearly a year. She begged for forgiveness, trying to explain that she wasn't even sure when it all began. Only that things between her and her husband had grown too distant, lacking passion, lacking communication. While Tran Ho was someone who needed her, who always showed her respect and care. Those confessions were like cold knives slicing into Ji-hai's heart, the wife he had trusted implicitly. The student he had supported with all his heart and hopes had betrayed him in the most bitter way possible, right on the very marital bed that held so many happy memories. Now the stage for the greatest humiliation of his life, the anger, the shame, and the sense of betrayal pent up for so long now erupted like a frenzied wave of emotions, as if trying to strangle every ounce of rationality in the Manwo had always been patient and composed. A fire of resentment had been smoldering in his heart for a long time, and now it had officially ignited in his bitterness. Ji-hai only whispered to himself Faith should have realized it long ago, his wife's recent changes from the new clothes she bought to the unexplained outings. All were clear signs, but he had been too naive, even thinking she was trying to amend their cooling marriage before her husband's burning gaze. Lilei didn't dare to argue, she only bowed her head, tears flowing endlessly. Deep down she knew she had committed an unforgivable mistake, not only betraying her life partner but also trampling on the professional honor, the teacher's ethics she had once proudly upheld. She tightly grasped her husband's hand, sobbing as she begged him not to report the matter to the school. In her panic, Lilei repeatedly promised she would completely end wrongful relationship, pleading with Ji-hai to think of their daughter, a child only 6 years old. She feared that if this story came to light, the girl would have no face left to live in this small town, where gossip always spread faster than any verdict. At that moment, upon hearing his daughter mentioned, the fire of anger in Ji-hai's heart temporarily subsided. He loved his daughter more than anything, and despite being betrayed to the core, he couldn't let the adult's mistakes become a psychological burden for an innocent child. However, the shame and hurt continued to smolder in his heart. After a sleepless night wrestling with torment, Ji-hai finally made a decision for his daughter. He would temporarily not make a big deal out of it. However, the condition was absolute. Lilei had to immediately and completely cut off all contact with Tran Ho and write a detailed self-criticism of all her wrongful actions. That was the final boundary Ji-hai could accept. Lilei, as if granted amnesty, nodded frantically in agreement, but she hadn't anticipated that Tran Ho, the student who seemed so obedient, would be an uncontrollable spark. The college entrance exam ended, and Tran Ho felt like a weight had been lifted. He performed outstandingly on the test, scoring perfectly in mathematics, and even his English was sufficient to pass the threshold for admission to a key university. But what excited him more than anything was the thought that he could now openly pursue Lilei, the woman he believed was his life's destiny. However, after the exam, Tran Ho could no longer contact Lilei. The messages he sent went unanswered. His calls met with silence. This sudden change left Tran Ho utterly bewildered, unsure of what had happened. In his anxiety and despair, Tran Ho decided to go to Lilei's house to get answers. When the door opened, the image of Lilei before him was like a completely different person. Her face was cold, her eyes evasive, her voice firm, every gesture exuding a cruel distance and iciness. There was no trace of the gentle woman Wo had sat beside him during those late-night tutoring sessions. Lilei, suppressing her emotions resolutely, declared that there could be no continuation between them. She told Tran Ho to find a love suitable for his youth, and that everything that had happened between them was merely a momentary mistake. Those words struck Tran Ho like a fatal blow. He stood, frozen, completely unable to believe what he had just heard. In his mind, the promises of old remained vivid that after graduating, he would get into university, work, and then marry her. All of that was now negated by a few short sentences. In his shock, Lilei only shook her head, admitting that those were just pipe dreams, an illusion that could never come true. She was a married woman with a daughter, with a career. She couldn't abandon everything for a young student. At that moment, Tranho's eyes suddenly sharpened. He fired off questions, trying to uncover the real reason for this drastic change. And then, with just a meaningful silence from Lilei, he immediately understood that Jihai had discovered everything instantly. Anger surged within him. Tranho, agitated, declared that he wasn't afraid of Teacher Ji. He was an adult now, and he had the right to pursue the happiness he chose. In his eyes, his love for Lilei was not something he could easily give up, but those words only made Lilei more resolute. She coldly interrupted, ending it all with an icy voice. She stated that Tranho was still just a child, who had never truly understood what love was. She was his teacher, and she should have been the one to guide and protect him, not let things veer off course as they had. With a decisive attitude, she declared that everything was over and demanded that Tranho stop contacting her from then on. But Tranho refused to give up for days on end. He kept waiting outside Lilei's house, calling, texting, writing lengthy letters, and slipping them through the door. However, all he received in return was absolute silence. Lilei never responded once. Her attitude was now resolute to the point of ruthlessness, as if she wanted to use cold decisiveness to snuff out the last flicker of hope in the young student. The pain of rejection, combined with the uncertain future after the college entrance exam, caused Tranho's mental state to spiral into serious instability. He gradually lost the balance he once had. Long drunken nights followed one after another. Tranho wandered alone in an erratic state, sometimes laughing foolishly like a madman, other times crying out in despair, eliciting pity from those around him. And then the tragedy truly began. That day, in a drunken stupor, Tranho went to Lilei's house again, his mouth incessantly shouting, demanding to see her. His midnight uproar stirred the entire neighborhood. Faced with the increasingly uncontrollable commotion, Lilei was forced to come downstairs, pulling him to a nearby park to talk, to avoid the prying eyes and gossip of neighbors. In the dim twilight of the late summer evening, Lilei quietly asked what he wanted, speaking while constantly glancing around with a look of panic and worry. Tranho was no longer the timid student of days past. He let out a mocking, distorted laugh in the heavy stench of alcohol. His voice rang out coldly, presenting two options. Either she agreed to continue their relationship, or she had to compensate him with 40,000 yuan to make up for the emotional damage Esh had caused. If not, he declared he would expose everything, so the entire town would know the true face behind the image of a respected teacher named Lilei. Hearing those words, Lilei stood frozen in place, unable to believe what she had just heard. When she asked if he was threatening her, what truly terrified her was not his answer but the look in Tranho's eyes, a strange, menacing, cold, and dangerous gaze. Tranho neither denied nor explained, only saying he was claiming what he deserved. His words were filled with resentment and blame. Tranho believed Lilei had exploited his feelings and then heartlessly discarded him like a useless object. He insisted that there was no such thing as an easy way out in this world. Those who caused harm had to pay a price. It was at that moment that Lilei truly realized the terrifying transformation in the person she had once thought was pure, the obedient student. The young lover she had once fiercely protected had now been so distorted by this wrongful and toxic relationship that he was unrecognizable, confused and frightened. She didn't know what to do, resorting to a forced promise to reconsider, hoping only to temporarily calm Tranho's anger before things spiraled further out of control. Returning home in a state of utter panic, Lilei immediately recounted everything that had happened to her husband. In her mind at that moment, she envisioned Jihai erupting in rage, smashing things or shouting furiously. But what surprised her was his demeanor. Jihai didn't raise his voice, didn't get angry. On the contrary, he appeared eerily calm, a calmness that was chilling. He only gently suggested that they should arrange to meet Tranho for a frank discussion. In his words, he still emphasized his role as a teacher, that he had a responsibility to guide his student back to the right path. However, what Lilei didn't notice was that in Jihai's eyes, there was no longer the tolerance of before. Instead, a sharp, cold glint of danger flickered as if signaling some quickly forming within him. Lile breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing those words. Believing that everything might be resolved peacefully, she was completely unaware that from the moment he discovered the truth, the calm and devoted husband she knew had died in silence. The initial waves of furious anger had passed. The excruciating pain that seemed capable of killing a man had gradually been replaced by a state of emotional numbness. Now, all that remained in Jihai was a heavy, deadly silence. Like a still lake before a great storm, on the evening of July 12, 2009, in the stifling heat of a lingering summer, three people crossed paths at a fateful intersection under the dim yellow light of the artificial candle in the town. The final curtain was about to fall. At 7 p.m. As agreed, Lile and Jihai went together to the familiar stone bench by the canal. Lile suggested meeting Tran Ho first, wanting to use words to persuade him, hoping to ease the student's vengeful mindset. Once things were settled, Jihai would appear. On the surface, Jihai agreed, but in reality, he had chosen a hidden position to observe the entire situation silently, like a predator patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. Tran Ho arrived on time as promised, a stark contrast to the disheveled mess of previous days. Today, he appeared in a clean white t-shirt, neat jeans, looking strangely alert and confident. When he saw Lile waiting by the park's stone bench, he smirked, flashing a cold smile before quickly walking toward her without beating around the bush. Tran Ho immediately demanded a clear answer. Had she reconsidered or not? Lile took a deep breath, speaking in a low voice that there could be no future between the man, urging him to face reality soon. Regarding his earlier demand for emotional compensation, she said she had discussed it with her husband and they agreed to provide him with 20,000 yuan as an incentive to continue his studies, on the sole condition that Tran Ho cease all harassment and never mention the past again. But Tran Ho's reaction sent a chill down Lile's spine. He burst into a mocking laugh, saying that 20,000 yuan was a pitifully cheap price for the feelings he had poured out. Right after that, he made a demand far beyond Lile's imagination, that she leave her husband and be with him, because in Tran Ho's eyes, their feelings were real, worthy of fighting for to the end. Though she tried to stay calm, hearing this made Lile lose her patience. She argued that love is not about possession, nor can it be based on threats or pressure. If Tran Ho truly loved her, he should know to let go and wish her a peaceful life, instead of dragging her into an inescapable quagmire. But those words were like adding fuel to the fire. In a fit of agitation, Tran Ho shouted loudly, fatal this tragedy stemmed from her never choosing him, that if she dared to take a chance on him just once in her life, he would prove was worthier than anyone else. The atmosphere was now tense as a taut string where a single spark would ignite a catastrophe. And at that very moment, a figure suddenly emerged from the shadows. It was Jihai, his face pale, his eyes flashing with a fierce, raging glint pushed to the extreme. He stepped out from the darkness, his voice ringing out cold as ice, filled with murderous intent. Jihai declared that enough was enough. He had once seen Tran Ho as a sensible student, someone with a future, but now, standing before him was nothing short of a destroyer, wrecking not only his family but his entire life. Contrary to fear or remorse, Tran Ho raised his head high, his voice unmasking defiance. He declared that while he had once respected Teacher Ji, in matters of love, they were two men on equal footing. He asserted that what Jihai couldn't give his wife, he, Tran Ho, was the one who could. Those words were like pouring oil on a fire. Jihai began trembling with rage. He growled each word, questioning Tran Hun what grounds he had to destroy his family, whether he even knew what his wife truly wanted. That woman was his lawful wife, the mother of the daughter he loved with all his heart. But Tran Ho didn't back down. He shouted, declaring that it was Lile who had chosen him. If she still loved her husband, why would she be with him? He shot back. That statement was like a sharp dagger stabbing straight into the heart of the betrayed man. In an instant, the fragile thread of rationality in Jihai snapped. Every emotion, anger, pain, humiliation surged like a raging wave, drowning the last of his reason. Immediately, Jihai pulled out the folding knife he had prepared in his pocket without another word. He lunged straight at Tran Ho, his eyes bloodshot like a wild beast. Li Lei, in a panic, screamed and rushed to intervene. But it was too late. The first stab struck directly into Tran Ho's abdomen, making him stagger back in shock, his eyes filled with bewilderment and disbelief at the man who had been his teacher. The husband of the woman he loved could act so ruthlessly, giving the victim no chance to react. Jihai struck again with a second, then a third stab, each blow carrying the weight of his resentment, his anguish, and the despair that had built up for too long. Li Lei continued to cry out, rushing between the two to stop them, but she was pushed to the ground. She could only watch helplessly as the tragedy unfolded right before her eyes. Jihai was like a beast out of control, swinging the knife several more times in succession. Blood gushed from Tran Ho's body, pooling red on the ground, staining the small path along the riverbank. When Jihai finally stopped, Tran Ho had collapsed onto the cold ground, his body drenched in blood, his breathing faint and nearly gone. Li Lei stood horrified, frozen in place, her eyes wide with shock as she witnessed the entire event unfold before her. In that moment, her mind went blank, all sounds around her seemed to be sucked out of the world. A deadly silence enveloped her until her body could no longer withstand the mental shock, and she collapsed unconscious to the ground. Only then did Jihai seem to snap out of his trance. He stared at the folding knife, still dripping with blood, gripped tightly in his hand, then silently looked down at the spreading pool of blood at his feet. Everything from the dim yellow streetlight, the blood-soaked ground, to the motionless body felt alien, as if occurring in a night Marie couldn't believe was real. Immediately, Jihai, trembling, took out his phoneme, called to report the incident to the police station. As soon as the case was made public, the entire town was shaken. An outstanding teacher had taken the life of his own student. The news quickly spread through tea houses, markets, and street corners. As the truth gradually came to light, public opinion split into many conflicting views. Some expressed sympathy for Jihai, believing was a victim of a cruel betrayal and had been pushed to a dead end, but many others strongly condemned Li Lei's actions. The woman who had trampled on the sacred quality saw an educator, and there were no shortage of sighs mourning Tran Ho. A young man due to blind love, fell into a tragic spiral. No matter which standpoint one took, no one could deny that this was a complete tragedy with no winners. At the trial, Jihai did not deny the charges. He admitted to all his actions of murder but argued Faith had committed the crime in a fit of rage. With no prior intent, he recounted the process of discovering his wife's affair, the betrayal by the student he cherished, and how Tran Ho had repeatedly threatened and provoked him, causing him to lose control. However, the prosecution argued that Jihai's actions clearly showed premeditation, evidenced by the folding knife he carried, indicating intent had already formed. In the end, the court determined that Jihai committed intentional murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment. Jihai will have to face severe punishment from the law. As for Li Lei, after the case, her mental state repeatedly collapsed. She voluntarily resigned, leaving the education sector in silence. With her young daughter, she moved to a distant place, hoping to start life anew. However, in the age of technology, what she had done was not easily forgotten. The name Li was still occasionally dragged up online, tied to scandal and sin. As for Tran Ho, his parents, simple farmers from a poor rural area, collapsed in grief when they came to claim their son's body. They couldn't believe it that the son they had pinned their hopes on the verge of entering university to change his life, had left in such a tragic way. They carried an unquenchable hatred, not only for the perpetrator Jihai, but also for Li Lei. During the trial, they repeatedly wailed, demanding the death penalty. For Jihai, Tran Ho's classmates were steeped in sorrow. No one expected that the quiet boy, academically excellent, especially in mathematics, would end his life in such a way. Many people were tormented for not noticing the warning signs sooner, for not reaching out in time to pull him back from the abyss. I once saw Tran Ho with teacher Li outside the school gate, but I never thought of that. A female classmate tearfully recounted, if I had reported it to the homeroom teacher of the school back then, things might have turned out differently. According to investigations, Lile's daughter also suffered significant emotional trauma after the incident. At school, she was frequently whispered about and scrutinized by peers, even after moving and changing schools. The shadow of the past continued to haunt her relentlessly. The case closed, but its echoes lingered. This was a tragedy with no victors. Only 3 broken familias and endless days of regret. It was like a mirror, clearly reflecting the fragility and complexity of human nature. More importantly, the case was a profound warning. No matter the circumstances, rationality and morality must never be relaxed. What do you think about this case? Please share your thoughts in the comments below this video. Don't forget to like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel to join Mysterious Casian, exploring more thrilling cases. Thank you all for watching today's video. See you all in the next video.